Please join me on this brief journey back to April 30th, 1789, here in Lower Manhattan. I promise to bring you right back to 2021 in a few moments.
Columbia, New York's Gazette of the United States, proclaimed in large type on April 29th, "Tomorrow is the day of her espousals, when, in presence of the King of Kings, the solemn compact will be ratified." Washington, the paper exclaimed, "by universal suffrages of a great and various people, would become president." In Lower Manhattan, that much-awaited day began with a cannon volley at sunrise, followed by church bells ringing throughout the morning. Crowds gathered in front of the president's house, but Washington remained inside until a deputation from the Senate and House arrived shortly after noon to report that Congress was ready to receive him. The retired general wore a tailed suit of brown Connecticut broadcloth with American Eagle buttons and tight calf-length pants, white knee-high silk stockings, and silver-buckle shoes. A hat, powdered hair, and dress sword completed his inaugural costume. Stepping outside, Washington bowed to the crowd before boarding a state coach as troops and dignitaries arrayed themselves in a preset order. At 12:30 p.m., the parade began moving slowly south on Cherry to Queen Street, then around to Broad Street before swinging north toward Federal Hall. One company of cavalry and 3 of infantry, about 500 soldiers in all, led the procession through cheering crowds from the presidential residence onward. The delegation from Congress followed the troops. Then came Washington, his 2 aides, heads of the federal departments, Chancellor Livingston, and other invited dignitaries. Citizens fell in behind the official party as it passed, all winding their way toward Federal Hall. "About 200 yards before reaching the hall," wrote the popular American author Washington Irving, who witnessed the event as a child, "Washington and his suite alighted from their carriages and passed through the troops, who would draw up on each side, into the hall and Senate chamber, where the Vice President, the Senate, and House of Representatives were assembled." The senators had gathered in their chamber first, and at the Vice President's prodding, discussed whether they should stand or sit while the President spoke. Before the Senate settled anything, however, House members filed in behind their Speaker and took seats to the Senator's right. More than an hour more passed before Washington finally reached the chamber, passed between the now standing members, bowed to each side. Adams stood up to invite him onto the Senate's outer gallery for the oath of office. Thousands were waiting to watch. The windows and the roofs of the houses were crowded, Eliza Morton observed from atop one of those roofs, and in the streets the throng was so dense that it seemed as if one might literally walk on the heads of the people. Washington stepped outside first, followed by Adams, Livingston, and as many of the assembled dignitaries and members of Congress as would fit. 18 people crammed on the narrow porch with Washington. Decades later, Morton could still recall the universal shouts of joy and welcome that greeted Washington's appearance on the gallery. Placing his hand on the large red Bible fetched for the occasion from Livingston's Masonic Lodge, Washington repeated the oath of office administered by the Chancellor. Most spectators heard none of it, however, until the end, when Livingston proclaimed in a loud voice, "Long live George Washington, President of the United States." Then the audience erupted again, cannons fired, and church bells rang. President Washington, after bowing to the people, went back into the Senate chamber to address Congress and invited guests, perhaps 100 persons in all. The audience for this speech, however, was much larger than Congress. Newspapers across America printed it, and foreign ministers in attendance reported on it to Europe. Washington reminded Americans of their national purpose. "The preservation of the sacred fire of liberty," he stated, "and the destiny of the Republican model of government are justly considered as deeply, perhaps as finally, staked on the experiment entrusted to the hands of the American people. Looking heavenward, he closed his address by asking divine blessing for the enlarged views, the temperate consultations, and the wise measures on which the success of this government must depend. And Washington took 20 minutes to deliver the 1,400-word address. From his entrance to his exit, the ceremony at Federal Hall ran under an hour. Thousands waited outside for the resumption of the inaugural parade, which the whole Congress now joined. Led by the same troops and assembled in a similar order as during the procession to Federal Hall, the augmented official party now walked several blocks up Broadway to St. Paul's Chapel, where it entered for divine services. With most of its war-ravaged buildings restored or replaced, the city now looked fresh and vibrant. Even though its population had increased dramatically since the war, many of the individuals now hailing Washington on this late April afternoon had done so in November 1783. Despite all that had happened to him and them in the intervening 5 years, Washington still embodied their hope for better times ahead. The church service did not last long. After the service, Washington rode by coach to his residence in time for a private dinner before going out at dusk to watch fireworks from Livingston's house overlooking the harbor. These fireworks likely reminded Washington of those that he had watched from a similar viewpoint on the evening after liberating New York in 1783. Many of the same types were used: spirals, fire trees, serpents, fountains, and flights of 13 rockets, and the display again ran more than an hour. So many people packed the streets of Lower Manhattan during and after the fireworks that coaches could not pass. Washington walked home. That night he had much to see. At the urging of civic leaders, New Yorkers celebrated the inauguration by illuminating the city with arrays of candles and lanterns in street-facing windows, front doors, open spaces, and public buildings. After walking north for nearly a mile through thinning crowds and darkening neighborhoods, Washington reached the presidential residence on Cherry Street after 10 p.m. and retired for the night. It was a day which will stand immutable and indelible in the annals of America, Lear wrote in a letter to Mount Vernon urging Martha Washington to come soon. Good government, the best of blessings, now commences under favorable auspices, the next day's newspaper announced. We beg to congratulate our readers on the great event. Those readers and all Americans arose that morning, May 1st, 1789, to the first full day of the first federal administration. Neither they nor their president would ever be the same.